Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/spookshow. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player.
It has been established that persons who have recently died have been returning to life and committing acts of murder.
Have you checked the children?
I want to play a game. The box. You opened it. We came.
Here.
This is the All-American Spookshow.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the All-American Spookshow Horror Podcast. I'm Josh, and I'm joined here with Professor Smoak.
Oh.
Donnie's a little under the weather this week, so he's not going to be here, and Will is on assignment, so you just got the two of us this week. But this is one of those, we're doing a Spookshow spotlight on the great life and career of horror icon George A. Romero. So this is one of those episodes where we don't necessarily need all four of us here, so it worked out. But we're going to be going through the career and talk a little bit about the life of George Romero, who unfortunately passed back in 2017. So already that's been 5 years, which is crazy to me. Like I remember it kind of happened unexpectedly, right? It kind of happened all of a sudden when he passed away.
Yeah, it was not too long before that I got to meet Romero at a Mad Monster party in Charlotte.
Was that the first time you got to meet him at that, or?
Well, unfortunately, it was the only time. Yeah, that was 2016 Mad Monster party. That was the only time I'd ever actually got to meet Romero.
Yeah, it was unfortunate. Like I never really got to officially meet him, although I was in the same place at the same time once, and we've talked about this before because it was back when you used to live here in Charlotte. He was here.
Yeah. It
was like Charlotte Film Society or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the occasion was, but basically they had George Romero here in Charlotte, and they screened Dawn of the Dead and The Crazies, and he was in attendance. Like they did like a Q&A or something. And when we were there, because I was there with Will, he was with me as well, and my future wife was there, and maybe a couple other people, but he actually had to leave, like during the screening, because it was when he went to go film one of his last couple movies. I can't remember whether it was when he was filming Diary of the Dead or Survival of the Dead. It was one or the other. And basically they were going to go start production, so he had to leave halfway through to go start production on it. So it was one or the other because it was around that time period. So that's the only time I ever got to be around him. Although I didn't get to meet him personally or get his autograph or anything like that, that was still pretty cool. So at least I had that, right? But cool dude, from what I remember. Very nice guy.
Yeah, I think I had. Do you recall what year that was? Because I think that might have been the year that I had just moved from Charlotte. Of course, that would happen.
Not off the top of my head, but it had to have been sometime around somewhere between 2007 and 9.
I know I left in 2009.
So it was maybe it was right around 2009 then, something like that.
I think I remember y'all talking about it or something going on with it, but I feel pretty certain that if I'd still lived there, I would have been there for it.
Yeah.
So that must have been the year I left.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure you would have. You probably would have went with us. So who knows? But yeah, that was a fun time, and that was cool. And on top of that too, not only because Romero was there, it was a group of like we've always say with these kind of things, like-minded individuals, so to speak. So it was cool to watch. It was cool to watch a screening of the Crazies and Dawn of the Dead with that group of people, with Romero around and everything. So that was really cool. Just the whole thing was really cool. But before we dive into Romero's life and career, I'll go ahead and throw out the usual information. You can contact us through email by sending us one at allamericanspookshow@gmail.com. You can find us on all the usual social platforms, Twitter, Facebook, all the rest. On Twitter, we're at AA Spookshow. Don't forget our TeePublic page where you can get logoed merchandise and other cool designs that we have there. Over on our YouTube page, every Wednesday night live at 9 p.m. East, we do Deadline Horror News where we go through the latest horror headlines. You want to go check out our YouTube channel for that and other things, so you don't want to miss any of that. And of course, we have our Patreon page where we want you to become a patron. Patreon.com/AA Spookshow, where we have every Tuesday we have video minisodes featuring the Library of the Professor. We have bonus podcasts every month, including like Crapster Piece Theater and Spookshow Rewind. The Professor has written articles, all kinds of cool stuff over on patreon.com/spookshow. And the links to all these things are found in the show notes. You'll see a Linktree link. You click on that, and you should find the links to every one of these things, listed top to bottom right there for your clicking pleasures. I guess we'll get, with all that out of the way, we'll go ahead and dive into the life and career of George A. Romero. Now, he was born in the Bronx in New York City, February 4th, 1940, and he graduated college at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He went, that's where he learned film and everything there. And he began his career shooting short films and commercials. And one of these things that he did in that time period was a segment for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I guess this probably would have been in sometime in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was about like Mr. Rogers going to get a tonsillectomy. So that was one of the first, I guess, quote unquote big things he got his hands on back then. But he and 9 of his friends formed Image 10 Productions. And that's the production company that went, got in together and made Night of the Living Dead in 1968. And we talked a little bit about that last week, how basically like, I think it was him and these 9 people basically threw in about $600 a piece. And so that gave them about $6,000. And then they quickly realized, like, yeah, this ain't enough. So that, they had to find other funding and everything. And then they were eventually able to put it together. And the rest, as they say, is history. And we went through the whole thing about the copyright mishap and everything. So now that movie is one of the most profitable, I would argue is probably one of the more profitable independent films ever made. Definitely one of the most influential independent films ever made. And horror, zombie, however you want to phrase it. And pretty much barely made a penny off of it. Because now because of that, the movie's in the public domain. So that means pretty much we could go get a copy of it and edit it to our pleasures. And nobody could say a thing to us about it. So that's how messed up it is. And
people have done that.
Yeah.
We've talked about it on the show. Well, I don't know if we talked about it on the show. We talked about it behind the scenes, so to speak. But one very memorable one is that, and I'm not going to be able to say the whole title of this movie because it's ridiculously long, but Night of the Day, of the Dawn of the Sun, of the Bride, of the Revenge of the Return. And I'm just going to stop there. I could probably go a little bit further, but I would only be halfway through the title of the movie. But somebody basically just took it and sort of recut it somewhat, not really, mainly plays straight through, and then dubbed it with their various voices. So you can do that to this movie, apparently. Or at least you could. I don't know about now.
The title of that sounds like one of those Wayans Brothers movies, like Scream or not Scream, but the Scary Movie. The Scary Movie, like don't drink your juice while being in the hood or whatever the hell.
Yeah.
Just this title that just keeps on going.
Even longer than that. Somewhat longer than your average giallo,
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, go back to last week's episode 101 for a little bit more information on Night of the Living Dead. But needless to say, one of our favorites altogether, one of our highest rated consensus star ratings that we've ever given any horror movie that we've ever talked about. I'm pretty sure it was like number 3 on the list behind like Jaws and maybe Reanimator, I think, without having the list pulled up. So yeah, needless to say, we all loved it, and we highly recommend you going to check it out.
Oh, definitely.
After Night of the Living Dead, in 1971, he made a film called There's Always Vanilla, and it's the only romantic comedy that Romero ever directed. And frankly, like, he didn't deviate too far off the horror path much more after that. And that one actually had Judith Ridley in it, who was the girl that played Judy in Night of the Living Dead. She was actually the star of that movie. Do you recall ever sitting down and watching There's Always Vanilla?
Well, I have it on VHS under the title The Affair. I think that was another retitling of it.
Okay, yeah.
We were talking about this in Library of the Professor segment, the last Library of the Professor segment, which most people and some people listening to this won't, be able to listen to if you're on Patreon, but that's a cue.
Yeah. Yeah. Patreon.com/Spookshow.
But we're talking about modern VHS releases, and the Affair was re-released by SRS Cinema, I believe it is, distributor that distributes some horror movies, a whole bunch of horror movies, their own productions as well. But they also get their hands on some of these older titles, and they put that one out. And I think I don't even know if that movie ever even got technically a VHS release back in the day, because I'd never seen it back then, and I would have seeked that movie out just because knowing, even though it wasn't horror, I still would have wanted to watch it because it was Romero.
If it did get released, I would imagine it was only because it was a George Romero movie. You know, like, I don't think it got very high marks.
No, it definitely didn't. And I mean, it's one of those movies where you can watch it knowing that it's a Romero film. You can see his editing style that he had and his way of putting a movie together and everything. You can tell that it's. I mean, if you've seen a number of Romero films, you can kind of tell that it's a Romero flick, despite it not being a horror movie. And I mean, it's no great shakes, but I mean, if you're a fan of Romero, it's definitely worth watching at least once.
I'm sure it's got to be interesting just to see him try his hand at something other than horror, knowing that he started with Night of the Living Dead and then mostly did horror after that, for the most part. That, you know, one of those deviations could be interesting if nothing else. A case study in the man's career, right?
Yeah.
Then the next year, 1972, this is one that I've not seen There's Always Vanilla, but I have seen this one. Season of the Witch, his return back to horror, and he actually wrote and directed that movie, so I'm sure you're a big fan of that one.
Yeah, that one's had a few, well, hasn't it had two different cuts? I think, I mean, I know I've only ever seen the VHS, the Thorn Emmy VHS version. And I've never owned it on DVD, but I'm pretty certain. I want to say that there's a longer or different cut version of it.
There may be
on the DVD.
The one that I watched wasn't too long ago, and it was the I guess the Arrow video release.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure exactly when that was released, but that's the one that I watched not long ago. And last I checked, I believe that's still up on Tubi TV. You know, if you want to watch that version of it, it definitely has a feel of a young filmmaker. That movie, you know, like you can tell he's still feeling things out, and it feels like one of those weird, like I don't know what the style would be, like almost like a fever dream kind of student film type of deal, where there's a bunch of random images and quick cuts, and what the hell's going on? You don't know what's real and what's, you know, and what's not, and but it's pretty cool though.
I don't know if I don't know if Rob Zombie ever mentioned it, but I don't know. I wonder if he got any influence from Season of the Witch when he did, what was his witch movie?
Lords of Salem?
Lords of Salem.
Yeah.
I mean, a little bit. I'm not saying that, you know, nothing like blatantly, but some of that like type of editing and whatnot.
You'd have to think that there's
sort of
there's some influence there, no doubt.
Atmosphere, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. Then the next year, you know, he was at a pretty high, cranking at a pretty high rate of turnout here throughout the 70s. But the next year, in 1973, another one of my favorites from Romero, The Crazies, that he wrote and directed. Once again, like I said earlier, I got to watch that one in a screening with Romero in the room, so that was awesome. But I'd seen that a time or two before, and maybe once since then, something like that. It has been a little while, but yeah, I love that one, and I didn't like the remake so much. Surprise, surprise. But
them crickets.
Yeah. Oh God. Those crickets, man, like, if nothing else, like, if the subject matter won't drive you crazy, the fucking cricket sounds will.
Incessant looping of cricket.
God.
What do you call that? Sound.
Yeah.
Audio in the background.
Oh, and it was and it seemed like it was even worse when I was in the theater watching it. Like, I was like, fuck. You know, it's like Romero was there, and he's like, hey, turn up the crickets. You know, like.
He's got the crickets in a totally different channel. He can just movement. You know,
he can just adjust.
Boost the volume. More crickets.
Yeah, I know what this movie needs. More crickets. Yeah, still like another well done movie that was like, you know, it's still a horror, but it's not like it's not a zombie flick. It's more of like a plague, like pandemic type of flick, right? But still, you know, you can see his style has now developed. You know, once you see this, you can see where he's going with things now for sure. You know.
And you mentioned the remake, but did you say you'd seen the remake before?
I had, and I went and saw it at the theater. And it hadn't been long after I had watched it, you know, like Romero's, not for the first time, but like I just watched Romero's. Maybe it was like in prep for that, you know. And boy, that was a big that was a big mistake. I remember not liking it, and I doubt time has healed any wounds there. I mean, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I saw it once, but I don't remember. I'd have to go back and revisit it. I don't remember.
I don't remember hating it. I don't remember hating it. I just know. I just recall not liking it nearly as well as Romero's, you know, classic, obviously. So, but maybe that's one. that's one that we need to get to, just to, you know, compare and contrast kind of thing. See if it's aged.
Yeah,
See if it has aged any better. In 1974, well, actually in the same year of 73, and then in 74, he started working like sports documentary stuff randomly. And throughout 1973 and 74, he produced and directed The Winners. It was a TV sports documentary series. It was about, like, each episode looked like it was basically about a different historical sports figure or something. Like, here's an episode on Babe Ruth, and here's one on Hank Aaron or something like that, you know. And then in 1974, he'd actually directed a TV documentary called O.J. Simpson, Juice on the Loose. And it's basically just...
Oh, yeah.
And it's basically just, from what I could tell, just like, here's about the life of O.J. Simpson and a little bit of, like, his playing career. Yeah, I'm sure that could be interesting in and of itself, just because George Romero made it, right?
Yeah. And also, this is probably a good time to talk about a little bit, going back to that commercial field he came from with I think it was the Latent Image. I think that was the name of the production company for the commercials, and then they formed Image 10 for Making Night of the Living Dead. But most of those people that made Night of the Living Dead were people he brought over from the making commercials.
Yeah.
He had a tight-knit sort of a circle going as far as, like, cinematographers. He did the editing and, you know, directing and producing and whatever as well, but writing, and all the circle of friends would go and make other movies. Sometimes, you know, they make some movies for Romero, and make some movies with John Russo, but there was this tight Pittsburgh community of filmmakers. They would branch off, like, even the score, like John Harrison that scored, say, Day of the Dead. He also directed a movie here and there, and then some people that were involved with Night of the Living Dead were involved with that movie. So this is a big mini Hollywood system of Romero horror movie, you know, writers and producers. And most of them were horror movies that came out, even from the other directors and the other people. So that's another thing. Well, maybe something for another spotlight down the road. The further
adventures of the Pittsburgh gang.
Yeah. And like Savini, we haven't mentioned Tom Savini, but he comes into the picture because, and I don't know, I guess this is a good place to talk about it, even though we mentioned it maybe in Night of the Living Dead, that he wanted to do the effects for Night of the Living Dead, but he was in Vietnam at the time Romero was making Night of the Living Dead. Savini was a combat photographer, so he saw a lot of messed up stuff through the camera lens, and he applied this knowledge, if you want to call it that, to his craft when he got out of the military and came back to the States and started doing special effects makeup. Some of the reasons why some of his stuff was so good and effective is because he'd seen the real thing, over the course of those years of Vietnam. So then he came back, and I know he did. I don't know if he did the effects on I don't think he did the effects on Season of the Witch. That might be something we'd have to look into. Or the one that you had mentioned after Season of the Witch was what was that next one, Josh?
The Crazies.
Did after that?
The Crazies.
Yeah, The Crazies. I'd have to look that up too, because I can't remember if he did the effects on that. But one movie I do know that he did the effects on was Martin, and I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah, that's about to come up here in just a second. But before we get to that, he did two other things. One that we just found out about basically last year and just released. In 1975, he produced, or he directed a short, well, it's not really a short film, but it's not necessarily a full feature-length movie either. It's less than an hour, but it's called The Amusement Park. And he made it for the Lutheran Society, and it was supposed to be a piece about elder abuse. And it was rarely seen until June of last year when, like, they finally got a hold of it and Shudder released it. So it is out there. You can watch it now. But apparently the subject matter was so disturbing that the Lutheran Society basically, nope, nobody's watching this. And they put it on the shelf for like the last 40-something years. So it finally saw the light of day last year. And we were actually going to do that when it came out last summer.
Yeah.
Remember? But that's when we kind of shifted gears and we started the Summer of the Wolf. So I never swung back around to watch that yet. But that's one that I definitely want to check out.
Yeah,
I've heard it's pretty messed up.
I'm going to check it out, but I don't know if we're going to do it on the show. I don't know if I'm going to wait till we do it on the show or what.
It might be a while. So I'm probably just going to go break down and go watch it myself finally, because it might be a while before we get around to it. But I'm sure we will eventually. But the next, so that didn't actually see the light of day until last year. But the next thing he worked on was a TV special. Randomly in 1976, he did a TV special called Magic at the Roxy. And basically, I think that's what it is. It's like an hour-long TV special on magic, like magicians and stuff. And this was noted for being the first television appearance of David Copperfield. So there's a little bit of a historical connection between David Copperfield and George Romero randomly there. But that same year, though, was when he wrote and directed a vampire horror movie known as Martin.
Yes, and you've seen that, right, Josh?
I know about it, obviously, but I don't think I've ever actually sat down and watched it, no.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Well, that's. I'm making mental notes of some of the things that I might be coming up on the professor's choice down the road. Stuff that is, to me, a very well, for people who are Romero fans that have seen it, it's not underrated. But if you haven't seen it, I think it's a very underrated Romero film. So I'll be really excited when we get to that one on the show.
I've seen quite a bit of his work, going down through this filmography here, but that's just one that I never got back around to watching for some reason. So I need to check that out. But then 2 years later, I guess you could say arguably, although most people probably wouldn't argue, he ended up writing and directing the best film he ever probably produced. And that was in 1978, Dawn of the Dead.
Yes, some people would say arguably the best. I would argue that it is the best because for me, there's no secret on the show. I've mentioned it numerous times. We've even put out our top 10 or top 13, whatever it was, favorite movies a while back. But Dawn of the Dead is my favorite horror movie of all time, and it's just a personal experience I've had with it that I'll wait to share all that stuff whenever we actually get around to doing Dawn of the Dead on the show. But it is my favorite, and some people would argue that Night of the Living Dead was the best, and you never topped that. But I can see that argument, whatever, but for me, it's Dawn of the Dead all the way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. Look, I love Night of the Living Dead. It's one of my favorite horror films, but Dawn of the Dead is a better movie.
Yeah.
I think
so.
And really, you can see it, like what we've talked about so far up to this point, and everything that kind of comes after this. To me, that's the pinnacle of his career. You know?
That's the point where all the, there was a handful of imitations that came out after Night of the Living Dead. Zombie, people that took Romero's idea of cannibalistic zombies and kind of ran with it, and there were some really good ones. But after Dawn of the Dead, it's just a glut of them came out, just boom, from every country, just about, from Spain, especially Italy, America, Mexico. I mean, there were zombie movies coming out of everywhere, about every country, and more than you could count on 2 or 3 hands. And
probably, and maybe you have to kind of contemplate, this might have started his ability to do a lot more things that he did down the road, especially with some of these little collaborations that he started doing, like in years after this, that we'll get into with Stephen King and Dario Argento and stuff like that. Those things probably don't come down the road if it weren't for Dawn of the Dead being such a masterpiece.
Yeah, because I think, speaking of Dario Argento, he had Romero come out to Rome to write the script for Dawn of the Dead in Italy. I don't know how much. I don't know if he wrote the whole thing there or what, but I know he came out there and wrote some of it. And Argento had the rights to the European market when he released it. That was part of the stipulation. He kind of helped semi-co-produce it, I guess you'd say.
Uh-huh.
And then Stephen King saw it, and I think he was blown away by it. And of course, that led to Creepshow down the road.
Yeah, it also, you could say, helped define or helped redefine what he had already started with Night of the Living Dead. In Dawn of the Dead, like it took that and then just cranked it up, and then refined it even a little bit more. And it's probably even closer to what we know now as like zombie lore, so to speak, right?
Oh yeah. That just the level of gore in that movie is just extraordinary, and the fact that he stuck to his guns, and we've talked about this in the ratings, the MPAA ratings episode, I believe. But the fact that he stuck to his guns and said, "No, I'm not going to release an R-rated version. I'm going to release it unrated because this is the way it's supposed to be, and I don't care who runs ads for it or doesn't run ads for it, or what theaters take it or don't take it." But he did it, for better or worse, because he could have probably raked in way more money if he had caved in and got an R rating and released it in more theaters and then maybe put it out unrated. But he was adamant about not doing that. So I can definitely commend him for sticking by his guns for that. Same with Day of the Dead. When he put out Day of the Dead, he refused to put out an R-rated version of it too.
And we should point out, because I don't know if we really pointed this out much in the Night of the Living Dead episode, he really was one of those mavericks, so to speak, and he worked outside of Hollywood. He worked outside of the studio system. Yeah, there were some that he did later on, like Monkey Shine, stuff like that, that were
Dark Stephen King.
Yeah. But for the most part, he worked outside of the system, so to speak, right?
Yeah, he he didn't have any love for it, I guess, because I mean he eventually he did, like I said, we talked about, but the Creep Show was kind of pretty much kind of in there. I mean, it was Romero's baby, you know. It's like you could definitely tell that Hollywood or the producers didn't have their hand in it. It was Romero and Stephen King that put that movie together. But when he got to doing like The Dark Half and Monkey Shines, you could definitely tell that was a studio picture with Romero's touch. But you could tell who was pulling the strings, so to speak, you know.
Frankly, Creepshow was probably his first foray into like mainstream type stuff, right? I mean, because everything that we've talked about up to this point was just independent type of, you know, small budget type of stuff. Even Dawn of the Dead. It probably wasn't until Creepshow where he actually got probably somewhat of a budget and quote unquote mainstream appeal, right?
Yep. Yeah, that one, and the actors, you know, you had like
that too, Ted Danson and Leslie Nielsen.
And
Adrian Barbeau.
A
number of others in that, but in between, you know, we just mentioned Creepshow, that was in 1982, but in 1981, in between, he did an action drama, which he wrote and directed, called Night Riders. Now, this is another one that I haven't seen.
Oh, man, that's a fun one. Mental note, actually, this won't be part of the part of our choices, because this is not a horror movie.
I'd say that'd be more Cult Corner. All you need to know is the synopsis or the description of that movie is basically like medieval night reenactors on motorcycles, right?
And Tom Savini plays an awesome role in that movie. Now, we didn't mention this, but Savini started guest cameo, and I mean, for Savini, acting was his main thing. He did the effects thing because, you know, Vietnam, and he got out and he was a fan of Lon Chaney, and he wanted to do special effects makeup, but his big dream was to be an actor. So he started acting in some of Romero's movies, like he was in a small role in Dawn of the Dead as part of the biker gang. It comes in at the end, you know.
Yeah.
And a few other roles in the movies, but in Knight Rider he had a bigger of a role, and it's pretty damn hilarious.
Yeah, and that one actually, and that one actually has Ed Harris in it as well. He's the star, and then Ken Faree is in that one. So some people that he obviously worked with, like, you know, Ken Faree was in Dawn of the Dead a couple years before that, a few years before that, and then remember Ed Harris showed up in Creepshow again, you know, a year after that. So a lot of connections there, and from before and after Night Riders. But like we mentioned, in 1982, he did Creepshow, which was a horror anthology film that was he directed and then Stephen King wrote. So we actually did that one all the way back in episode 17. So if you want to go revisit what we had to say about that one of my personal favorites. It was a good episode that we did, but that movie is one of my personal favorites. It doesn't necessarily make like my top 10 list or anything like that, but anytime Creepshow's on, I'm sitting down and watching it. It's one of those kind of movies for me, so I've always loved that movie. And how can you go wrong with fucking George Romero and Stephen King collaborating? What the fuck, man? That's awesome.
Yeah, and off the wall, kind of like Leslie Nielsen, awesome, and Ted Danson. Yeah, they're in the, you know, that's an awesome segment.
Yeah, just the whole thing. Just and it's put together like in a 50s comic book style, like just everything about it, man. Just Romero and King nailed it.
Yeah.
It's intermission time. Time to pause and refresh at the snack bar. During this short break, you can treat your taste of good food and sparkling cold beverages, including delicious Coca-Cola. If you're hot dog hungry, we have them. Sizzling, juicy hot dogs served in warm, oven-fresh buns. Plus a complete menu of all your favorites. Visit the refreshment center now. Enjoy delicious food and ice-cold Coca-Cola.
But around this time, like a couple years after that, but before his next feature film, he was the executive producer and creator of Tales from the Dark Side, a horror anthology series. And he actually wrote like 2 screenplays and 2 episodes. So it was basically 4 episodes he actually wrote for Tales from the Dark Side. But that's basically what he worked on for the most part during that time period, other than making a couple more feature films around that time. So any thoughts on Tales from the Dark Side?
Yeah, I remember. I love the show. I love the opening. The opening was always creepy to me. You know, come on, man.
Yeah, look, I was born in 1980, so like when this came out, I'm like 4 or so. But like I remember my dad watching it when I'm like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and being just creeped the fuck out by the opening. You know, when I was a little kid.
The opening, and the narration.
Yeah, but I love it. I've got the whole series on DVD, man. I love that's like one of my personal favorite anthology series.
It was great, and some some episodes of merit to mention is again with the Tom Savini connection. Remember the one with Lizzie, the closet monster, little
yeah,
monster kid or whatever was in the closet. He directed that episode too, I think, and of course he created the Lizzie process or the Lizzie Muppet, not Muppet.
Muppet. No. Don't say that. The ghost of Jim Henson will come kill you or something.
And also the was there a Christmas episode of that? I know there was a Halloween episode.
Yeah, I want to say there was one. I could be wrong, but I want to say it was kind of like that same kind of episode with the killer Santa Claus kind of thing. But maybe I might be confusing that with Tales from the Crypt. Yeah. But I think there was
a related thing in there. But I have to pull it out. I got the whole set, but I haven't watched it. I mean, I probably saw every episode back in the day, but I haven't watched it from beginning to end on that DVD set, and I need to do that.
Yeah, I think I started watching that DVD set a while back, and I haven't finished it, but I'm pretty sure when I sat down and watched it, I got through almost through season 2 on that, so I need to get back to watching it. But yeah, I've always been a huge fan of Tales from the Dark Side. Other than Tales from the Crypt, I think that was my favorite anthology series from that time period, where there were a number of them. Yeah,
from that era, I guess overall, my favorite is probably Twilight Zone, the old school one. But from the era that I grew up in,
in the 80s,
it would definitely be. Tales from the Crypt.
From the 80s and into the 90s, I think it was Tales from the Dark Side and Tales from the Crypt, in my opinion, were the two best ones, depending on the episodes and all that.
Yep.
Now, Tales from the Crypt had a better quality to it because it was on HBO, but still, Tales from the Dark Side, considering that it was I think it was like a syndicated type of show, right? I believe. I don't think it aired on one particular network. Considering that, I think they really pushed the envelope.
And there was a ton of of these anthology things going on, including the Twilight Zone. What do you call that? Remake? I don't know. The Twilight Zone, the newer Twilight Zone series from that time period.
Reboot, however you want to frame it.
Yeah, there was also Outer Limits.
Yeah, that was
there was
another reboot.
There was a reboot of the Outer Limits, but I can't remember if that was 80s or 90s. But they were all kind of flowing around that same time period.
Friday the
80s.
Friday the 13th series. You had Freddy's Nightmares.
Yeah, there was a
Monster.
Yeah, for my money, those two were
Monsters, right? Wasn't that another one during that time period?
Yeah, that was fun too.
Yeah, a lot of good individual episodes on all these other ones, but like we said, Tales from the Dark Side and then Tales from the Crypt. I think those were the two from that time period that really those still have a lot of rewatch appeal even today. Then in 1985, during this stretch, he wrote and directed his return to zombie horror, Day of the Dead. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's weird. If you listen to, going back years to right after Day of the Dead was released, there was a lot of zombie fans that's their least favorite, or not just least favorite. There's some that just don't like that movie for whatever. And then there's some that that's their favorite movie of the trilogy. I believe my wife, that's her favorite movie is Day of the Dead of the three.
I love
close. It's right there with Dawn of the Dead and everything. Ranks it up there near the top. I love it. I mean, like I said, Dawn of the Dead is gonna be my favorite because that's my personal first experience because I saw Night of the Living Dead first, but it was. And I probably mentioned this too. Dawn of the Dead is the one that got me into moving me from being a casual horror fan into needing to know who directed this, what other movies did they direct, who did these effects, who did this music,
Yeah.
It pushed me from being a casual fan into straight horror fandom, obsession, whatever you want to call it.
A gateway drug.
That will always be that. Yeah, The Gateway. It was a gateway movie, and that will always be my favorite. It's a great movie, but just because of how much it personally tied me into the genre and everything. But Day of the Dead is still way up there for me. I love that movie, even though he didn't have the budget that he wanted to have for it. He planned and he wrote a script that was much bigger of a budget than what he was able to shoot when he finally got the money for it. And I had to cut a lot of stuff out of it. And some of the stuff actually found its way into Land of the Dead. I can't remember the name of that mobile, not a tank because it didn't have treads, but it had tires. But that zombie killing truck thing they drove in Land of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
He had a name for it in the movie. They called it something, but that tank / military vehicle or whatever, he wanted to have that in Day of the Dead, and also this whole other, part with the military installation and more military-related scenes. Just didn't have the money for it. And then they found that underground bunker, and he decided he could retool the movie and narrow things down and be able to shoot it there. and put out a decent flick, which I think he did a great job of doing.
I'm sorry.
I think it's the best effects work. Sorry, I just thought of something about Savini again. Was that of the 3 zombie movies, that's probably the best one for his zombie effects and the gore. You know, there's a lot of damn awesome gore set pieces on that movie.
Yeah, it's hard to argue that. Then it was 2 years after that, in 1987. He did not direct it, but Creepshow 2 came out, and he wrote the screenplay for that. Him and Stephen King both collaborated again on that, but it had a different director for that one. It was directed by Michael Gornick. It was worth mentioning since that that one is roughly as popular as the first Creepshow, right?
Yeah. I think it's. I mean, I like the first one better, but this one's still up there again, like kind of like the Day of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead thing. You know, it's still really great and has really great stories to it. And also Michael Gornick, as I mentioned before, how they kind of went through their circle of filmmaking friends in Pittsburgh. I believe he was connected to other Romero films. I want to say maybe he was director of photography on Dawn of the Dead. I could be wrong, or camera operator or lighting, somewhere in there. He was you know, behind the scenes on Dawn of the Dead as well as other Romero films. So still an in-house, in-family director, even though Romero didn't direct it.
Then he wraps up the 80s by working on or writing and directing his last horror movie of the 80s in 1988, Monkey Shines. I know I've seen that movie, but it's been a long time ago, so it's like I barely remember it. I think it's one of those where I'll probably plug it in and be like, oh yeah, I remember this, this, and this. But it's been so long now for me that I don't remember a lot about it.
Still remember seeing that one in the theater. That was one of the few. I mean, that because it was his, not counting Creepshow. I didn't see Creepshow in the theater. I mean, that was 1982. That was still too early for me. I would have been like 9 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, not that I wouldn't have gone to see it at 9 if my parents had taken me to see it. I was sure I'd see it in the theater, but they weren't going to be taking me to see Creepshow at 9.
Yeah.
But Monkey Shines was probably the first Romero film I saw in the theater.
Yeah, and I believe, if I recall, I think that was like kind of his first official like studio film too, Monkey Shines. Other than you know, whatever work he had done with Creepshow, I don't know if that kind of counted. But I think the first one he actually did, where he wasn't producing and the studio had the final say, so to speak, was Monkey Shines. But then he enters the 90s with a few things right out the gates in 1990. This is probably one of his last really busy periods of his career. He made Two Evil Eyes, which was a collection of like horror tales with Dario Argento. He wrote and directed the segment The Facts in the Case of Mr. Voldemort. You got any thoughts on Two Evil Eyes and his segment in it?
Yeah, it's of the two segments, my personal favorite is the Argento one, and I think that just has to do with the material, because Argento's was primarily the Black Cat, but I think they kind of wove other Edgar Allan Poe stories into it, so it wasn't just the Black Cat. And Romero had the facts in the case of M. Voldemort or Mr. Voldemort, and I know why he's got that one, because anybody who's seen it, it's dealing with basically a zombie. I mean, he's not a cannibalistic zombie, but he's somebody who's passed on and comes back, so to speak.
Yeah.
So you can tell that. I don't know if Romero chose that or if the studio chose it for him, but because it dealt with a zombie, you can see Romero's fingerprints on it. And I like that story. I love that movie, and I like that story quite a bit. But my favorite of those two would be Argento's, and that's just because, again, not necessarily having to do with the making of the films or putting together the films, but it just has to do with the original story content.
Yeah. That same year, he took part in Tales from the Dark Side, the movie. He wrote the segment Cat from Hell. It's been so long since I sat down and watched that, I don't recall that right away. And I know I've seen it. It's just been a while.
I'm trying to think. Cat from Hell. I remember, what I remember about is not Lizzie, but the gargoyle thing and the mummy.
Yeah.
Those are the two I remember the most about that from that movie right now, because it's been a little bit since I've seen that one as well. And the gargoyle, the mummy segment are very distinct, and I can't remember right now. Yeah, oh wait, no, I do remember the cat one.
There you go.
I do remember something very much popped into my head about. I'm not, I don't know if we're giving away spoiler type things on this, but I do remember a cat coming out of or going into somebody.
Yeah. You know what? I kind of remember that too. Now that you say that, I think you're right. You know, the ironic twist here on that is, for me, I just bought this movie on Blu-ray like a couple weeks ago, so I need to sit down and watch it again clearly. But then that same year, the last thing, he wrote the screenplay and executive produced for the remake of Night of the Living Dead, which was directed by Tom Savini.
Yeah, that one I also saw in the theater. And what I remember about that one is, have you seen it, Josh?
No, I think I mentioned that last week. Like, for whatever reason, I've never sit down and watched this. And I even own it. I own a copy of it and just fucking never sit down and watch it.
I liked it better when I watched it again later. Yeah, when I saw it in the theater the first time, and it wasn't because I thought it was a bad movie. It was just that I hated the MPAA. Being a horror fan, I really hated the MPAA during this era because they gutted horror movies. They wouldn't let them get away with hardly anything when it came to gore.
Yeah.
And they had to cut a lot of stuff out of this movie, including gunshot squibs. I mean, you couldn't even shoot a zombie in the head. I mean, nowadays they'll let you get away with monsters getting killed and all kinds of gore when it comes to killing a monster. But back then they wouldn't even let you do zombie violence. Like shooting a zombie in the head and having a blood squib was a big deal, So that had to be cut out.
It was just one of those weird time periods with that stuff at that time.
Yep. So that kind of like soured my taste on it for a little bit. I mean, on my first viewing of it in the theater.
Yeah.
I remember after the fact kind of liking it, but I'm like, damn, this is a bloodless, or, it wasn't completely bloodless, but compared to any Romero zombie film that had come out prior to this, which would have just been the original Night, Dawn, and Day, as well as Return of the Living Dead had come out, Russo and Dan Bannon's movie or whatever. It didn't have any of the gore of any of those movies. It had even less gore than the first Night of the Living Dead, which came out in 1968. But
wow,
again, it was the MPAA gutting it basically. But in retrospect, you can watch it knowing that you're going into it. I think it's a underrated remake.
This one was just I thought it was funny, so I'll point it out when I found it in my research. In 1991, he had a cameo in Silence of the Lambs as one of Hannibal Lecter's jailers. So I figured that around this time period, it was just funny to point it out.
I don't even know if I remember. I mean, now that you mentioned that, it seems it kind of strikes something in my memory. But if I had heard that before, it had gone out of my mind until you just brought it back up. Now I'm gonna have to watch it again and look for that part.
Yeah, I'm sure it's very brief, but yeah, I thought that was kind of funny. But then a couple of years later, in 1993, it's the first thing he had directed, like his first feature-length film that he had directed or done anything on since Monkey Shines in '88, The Dark Half in 1993. And that was a horror thriller which he directed, wrote, and executive produced, and it was based on a Stephen King novel. Yeah, that was yet another victim of the MPAA, and I think probably one of the reasons why Romero decided after that, it's like, fuck this. Yeah.
Fuck this Hollywood studio system crap,
Oh, yeah.
He didn't have control over that.
He was pretty much done as far as anything mainstream or anything even remotely resembling a studio production after that. That was it. Because pretty much for the rest of his life, he worked outside of it and only produced, only made really a handful more of things, including, that was in 1993, so really didn't do much between that and 1998. He actually produced and directed an unaired pilot about pro wrestling called Iron City Ass Kickers, which I don't believe ever saw the light of day. Like I said, it was an unaired pilot until last year. Apparently it was released on like VHS or something like that. I'm not sure exactly who got this and put it out, but it was released on VHS just in 2021. I'm guessing it's just that one pilot episode of Iron City Ass Kickers, which it makes sense. 1998, like, wrestling was in a real big boom period at that time, so I'm sure that had to have something to do with, him wanting to capitalize on that during the time. But that'd be interesting to check out for sure. Then in the next year, in 1999, I thought this was pretty awesome. He directed a music video for the Misfits called Scream. That was the song. And the only payment he got for doing this was he wanted the Misfits to appear in his next film, which came out the next year in 2000, called Bruiser. His only payment was he wanted the Misfits to appear in that movie, and then they did 2 original songs for it. So that's the only thing he got paid for, to do a Misfits music video.
I'm pretty sure the Misfits were like, yeah, hell yeah.
What? All we got to do is this? Fuck yeah, George Romero, let's do it.
Romero movie, sure, yeah.
And obviously they played a role in that, and that came out the next year in 2000, Bruiser, and that was another horror movie which he wrote and directed. Now I've never seen that one. Have you? Yes, you recall?
Yeah, that one. I like that one. It's another kind of, it's not a masterpiece. It's not even a late era Romero masterpiece, but it is definitely worth a few. I've seen it a few times. I've seen it at least twice. I'm not going to say it's like, again, throwing the term around. It's underrated, but I mean, it is well worth watching. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And like I said, that was his return.
Not going to be your top favorite Romero film or anything, but.
And like I said, that was his return to feature films and horror for the first time in 7 years. So if nothing else, it's worth kind of seeing his renaissance right there. But it would take him 5 more years after that until he finally returned to zombie films. Because I remember at some point in between there, he had said, like, yeah, I'm done with zombies. But I guess he wasn't. He eventually came back around to it.
That, there's a few things, right, we talked about on maybe some of the other, somewhere else, maybe on the Night of the Living Dead episode, that he was in talks to direct the Resident Evil movie.
Yeah, yep.
And then, I don't know, something happened in there. Well, I don't know what exactly, but that fell through. And it might have been something else that he was supposed to, because he was attached to something zombie related a few times. And then either from his own backing up of it or from the studio or whatever, he was unattached of it.
Yeah, there were a number of things during that time period between 2000 2005, well, late 90s, I guess, 2005, were like mid to late 90s, about a 10-year period there, whatever. That basically there were a lot of, like, he was close to doing things, and then just for one reason or another, just, no, that ain't going to happen. And Resident Evil was one of them. There was a film adaptation of the Goosebumps book, Welcome to Dead House, that apparently he was supposed to do, and then I guess he couldn't do it.
I knew there was another zombie.
Yeah, apparently he couldn't do it the way he wanted to do it, so he's like, well, here's the middle finger, that kind of thing. So basically there was a lot of that stuff during that, 5 to 10 year period there. But then, like I said, he returned to zombie horror in Land of the Dead in 2005, which he wrote and directed. And that began kind of a new trilogy somewhat, right? Because I think I've heard or read somewhere that, like, basically Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead, and Land of the Dead are all connected. With some time period in between. Like, I think Land of the Dead is supposed to be like 20 years later after Night of the Living Dead. But then the next two that he came out with, which ended up being his last two projects, in 2007, Diary of the Dead, which he wrote and directed, and then in 2009, Survival of the Dead, which he also wrote, directed, and executive produced, and that was his final film. They were connected, but not as connected as the other ones, apparently. I think that was going to kind of be... Apparently, like, Survival of the Dead was supposed to be more connected to Diary of the Dead than it ended up being. But then apparently one of the last things that he was going to do was going to be more of a follow-up to Diary of the Dead. But unfortunately, he never made it there because he passed away in 2017. But I guess it was just that period of time between Survival of the Dead in 2009 to 2017. He just could never really get anything off the ground. But that one was supposed to be Road of the Dead. And I think that was supposed to be more connected, like I said, to Diary of the Dead than it was necessarily Survival of the Dead. But so much so that, like, I think, like, he had just, like, literally like 3 or 4 days before he died, he had released a poster for Road of the Dead and, like, was talking about, like, where he was going to go with it story-wise and everything. And then literally July 16th, 2017, which was like 3 days later, he passed away following a brief but aggressive battle with lung cancer. That was according to a statement by his longtime producing partner, Peter Grunwald. And the last little bit that I found there was Romero died while listening to the score of one of his favorite films, The Quiet Man, with his wife, which was his third wife, Suzanne Desrocher Romero, and his daughter from a second marriage, Tina Romero, were at his side when he passed. So, unfortunately, somewhat of an untimely end there for George Romero, but like we said off the top, that to me it just kind of came out of nowhere. Like, I don't remember hearing anything about him being sick, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, he's dead. What? At least that's what I recall of it at the time.
Yeah, I know. Like, anytime you ever saw an interview with Romero or seen him behind the scenes, he was smoking. Like, I think he was like a chain, like one after another, light off.
Yeah.
Literally, anytime he was doing an interview, he had a cigarette.
And unfortunately, that cut short the life of a horror icon and one of the greatest directors of our lifetimes for sure. But yeah, I mean, what more can you say, really? I mean, we went through it. He did write a few books too. I'll just mention a few from his bibliography there. He wrote Dawn of the Dead with Susan Sparrow, and that was a movie tie-in in 1979. Another movie tie-in in 1984, Martin with Susan Sparrow. Then he wrote a couple of comic books. Toe Tags, which was a 6-issue miniseries for DC Comics back in from 04 to 05, and then Empire of the Dead, which was I think a couple of tied together series that tied into his Of the Dead universe. That was for Marvel Comics in 2014 to 15. Then around the time of his death, Nights of the Living Dead, which was co-edited by Jonathan Maybury and George Romero. And then just a couple years ago, The Living Dead with Daniel Krauss was released. But yeah, I mean, what more can you say about the man's legacy of just being a horror icon and one of the most influential horror directors, writers, producers of all time, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I love I love that he did it in his home, well, maybe not necessarily his hometown. I know he was born in New York, but I mean, relocated to Pittsburgh. And he did everything right out of Pittsburgh up until maybe Land of the Dead. You remember there that time when Land of the Dead came out, how Toronto, a lot of people were getting financial cuts by going to Toronto and shooting in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he had maybe relocated to Canada at the time he was doing that set of movies.
Yeah, I think by the time he got up to that, he was in Toronto.
But those other ones, I have this thing. I love regional horror movies. Like I love seeing rural horror movie, movies shot in whatever this happens to be this area over here. And a lot of times they're low budget, super low budget, like Night of the Living Dead. And most of the time they're not anywhere near as good as Night of the Living Dead. But you can see a lot of heart and effort and heart and soul or whatever, blood, sweat, and tears go into these movies. And I love seeing these different regions, especially if it's somebody making multiple movies over the course of time in that area, such as what's his name up in Earl Owensby in North Carolina.
Yeah,
as he was doing up there, in the Charlotte / all that area right there.
Yeah, I think it's kind of that mid area, like in the Piedmont between like Charlotte and the foothills kind of area where he was doing a lot of that stuff. But yeah, another local guy.
Just you said, that level of dedication and love for the genre that you don't care about moving to Hollywood to where you probably could. Romero probably could have jumped into Hollywood right after Night of the Living Dead. He probably could have relocated there and made himself millions and millions and millions of dollars in Hollywood if he had just, just on the clout of Night of the Living Dead, being the director of that movie.
Yeah, even by the time he got up before to Dawn of the Dead, he definitely could have for sure by then.
Oh yeah.
But like you said, he stuck to it. You got to give him credit there, no doubt. But yeah, there's, like I said, there's no denying his influence, his legacy. And of course, on our show, Romero will live forever, and on a lot of other horror podcasts. And if you call yourself a fan of horror, you are a fan of George A. Romero. So, unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He's been gone for almost 5 years, but his legacy will live on forever here on the Spook Show and everywhere. In every film that the dude ever made. So, hats off to his career, and it was cool to be able to take this time to sit down and talk about just him and his career and everything. And the other thing that we found here is there's a lot of movies that we need to get to. we've only scratched the surface with George Romero, with Creepshow and Night of the Living Dead, and we got lots and lots to come. So I look forward to that, and I'm sure you should too. So more things to come up, to look forward to here in the month of April is next week. You get my choice, my turn of the rotation, and we're going to be watching Deathgasm from 2015. So I hesitate to say there's anything Romero-esque here other than just craziness. I'd say to me this movie reminds me more of something Sam Raimi would have made, but I'm sure the influences are there, right?
Oh yeah. Hell yeah, because Sam Raimi himself was influenced by Romero.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think anyone that has anything to do with horror since Night of the Living Dead has been influenced by George Romero. It kind of goes without saying, really. But that's going to be next week.
The more extreme field.
Yeah. But that's going to be next week. We're going to get to Deathgasm in episode 103. But then in episode 104 is going to be our first Cannon Fodder episode, where that series, that little sub-series that we'll weave in and out of, it's a new part of the rotation, is basically where we choose one random Cannon Films movie from their vast catalog. And literally we just did it a couple weeks ago on Deadline Horror News. We spun the wheel of we all chose a movie, and the one that came out on top was Over the Top. So look forward to that on episode 104, the Stallone Cannon Films classic. you really stopped short of saying classic, but I guess at this point, why not, right?
Right. Oil up those biceps.
Yeah.
Get ready.
How often can you say you're going to watch a movie about a dude arm wrestling for the custody of his kid? And a big rig. So, only at Canon, man, would this fucking thing have been made. And Thank God it did. All I can say is, and we'll say this a lot, thank God for Golan and Globus, right? Because
they gave some classics.
Oh,
and yeah. I say that classic, like actual. I mean, they gave us some fucking stinkers.
Yeah,
look at the apple, but
oh fuck.
But they gave us bona fide classic '80s.
Yeah, I'm looking.
I don't know, just something about them that you can't replicate these days.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to our journey through the Canon catalogs and Canon fodder. That's going to be something we weave in and out, but I'm looking forward to it because there's going to be a lot of fun movies that we can do there with that. So we're going to start. We're going to start it off in a big way with the Stallone Canon flick, Over the Top. So come back in a couple weeks for that. But I guess that's all for now. Like we always say, head over to our YouTube channel every Wednesday night live at 9 p.m. East for Deadline Horror News. All the cool stuff we got going on over at patreon.com/Spookshow. You don't want to miss a thing. Lots of cool stuff, and our involvement with the Morbidly Beautiful Podcasting Network. You want to go check out their website and all the cool things they got going on there with other, I guess, our broadcast partners now on the podcast network. So you want to go check that out. So I guess that's pretty much it for this week. So for Will and Donnie, who couldn't be with us, and the Professor Smoak, I'm Josh. We are the All-American Spook Show Horror Podcast, and we will talk to you next week for Deathgasm.
And in the immortal words of George Romero, stay scared.
Please replace the speaker on its rack when you're ready to leave. Failure to do so will damage both the speaker and your car. We'll be grateful, and so will the patrons who follow you.